Everything, everything gonna be all right this morning.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another episode of It's Me Speaking to You. I am, as always, your ever faithful host, Mr. Jeffrey Wilson, coming to you live and direct from the gateway to the West, St. Louis, Missouri. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we have a jam-packed, informative episode. This man quite literally is, and I don't say this facetiously, he is a hero of mine. I've been following his work for about 25 years. He was featured in a program called Reasonable Doubt, which was produced in 1988 on the Kennedy assassination, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Cyril Wecht is joining us today. This gentleman is the president of the American Academy of Forensic Science, the head of the American College of Legal Medicine. He served on the U.S. House of Representatives House Select Committee on Assassinations, and he was recently portrayed by Albert Brooks in the film Concussion. Dr. Wecht, thank you so very much. I know you're busy, sir. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure being with you. Thank you for contacting me.
Absolutely. Now, we don't have much time, so getting into this JFK conversation and the assassination of the president could take hours, because there's so many different layers of it. But specifically, I want to speak to something that you are an expert on, obviously, having dealt with the forensics, the tissue, the clothes, the bullets. Specifically, the single bullet theory, sir, is what the government seems to hold on to as their main evidence of Lee Harvey Oswald in his 3 shots with his Italian rifle. What problem, sir, do you have with the single bullet theory?
Okay, let's, for your listeners, set the background for this. The Warren Commission, meeting then into 1964, soon found themselves confronted by an incredible, seemingly impossible physical incongruity. The timing of the Zapruder film, in which you study frame by frame, 18.3 frames moving through that camera per second, which I had the opportunity to do in 1966 at Life Magazine headquarters with Professor Josiah T. Thompson, showed clearly and unquestionably that Connally was struck 1.5 seconds after Kennedy was hit the first time. That's before Kennedy's headshots. Then they got the Mannlicher Carcano, this non-automatic carbine, the most inferior weapon of its genre anywhere in the world, according to all long gun experts. And they got the best experts they could find. Lee Harvey Oswald was not an expert. So they got the best experts, and they had them shoot at targets, not moving targets, not counting accuracy, but just determining how long does it take to shoot, unload, reload, and shoot again, 2.3 seconds. Well, there you were. Meantime, Oswald's dead. J. Edgar Hoover has told the world that the case is all over. So how do you deal with that? Arlen Specter, later to become senior U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania, at that time junior legal counsel for the commission, he came up with the idea of a single bullet theory. What if one bullet went through Kennedy and then into Connally and produced all those wounds? So that is the single bullet theory. One bullet producing 7 wounds into Kennedy's back, out through his throat, into Connally's back, out from the front of his chest, into the back of his wrist, out the front of his wrist, and then into his left thigh. And by the way, the stretcher bullet, Commission Exhibit 399, the bullet that was found on beneath the stretcher by the emergency room by the maintenance man trying to get to the men's room that afternoon at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, that is the hero. That bullet, for a little bit more of historical significance, is the bullet that they said the pathologists, who were totally incompetent and inexperienced on the night of the autopsy, they said that bullet was from Kennedy's back. That when the president lay on the table and the doctors applied cardiac massage to the front of his chest, they forced the bullet back out through the same hole in his back, because when they did the autopsy that night, they completely missed a bullet hole in the front of his neck. It wasn't until the next day when they talked with the doctors and learned that a tracheostomy had been done, superimposed on a pre-existing bullet hole. Then the next day, Saturday, November 23rd, that stretcher bullet, 399, was the bullet from the front of Kennedy's neck. 5.5 months later, under the single bullet theory, the stretcher bullet was now from Connally's left thigh. So back to then your questions. The reasons that the single bullet theory is absurd First, well, let's make one of admittedly subjective nature, but very significant, and that is that Governor Connolly and his wife insisted from the very beginning and never changed their opinions over the years when interviewed, that first interview taking place while he was still a patient in the hospital, that the president was shot. They heard the shot. The governor turned, and then as he was turning back, he was struck. But let's move on to science. The weight of the bullet, the condition of the bullet, and the trajectory of the bullet. Those three things.
The condition is something that's really huge.
Yeah. Okay. Now, the bullet in its store-bought condition weighs 161 grains. Copper-jacketed, lead-core, military-type ammunition, about 1.25 inches in length, 1/4 inch in diameter, 6.5 millimeter. That bullet, as it was found, then weighed 158.6 grains, a loss of 2.4 grains, which is exactly 1.5%. And yet we know, documented, and I spoke myself with the chief nurse, Audrey Bell, who was given fragments by the attending surgeons on Governor Connolly to turn over to the FBI, and there are fragments that Connolly took to his grave, in his wrist, and his thigh, that we're told that all these fragments together weighed only 1.5% of the total weight of the bullet. That's ridiculous, impossible. Number two is its condition. The bullet not only produced 7 wounds going through these two gentlemen, but broke and destroyed 4 inches of Governor Connolly's right fifth rib, produced a comminuted, which means a fragmented fracture of the distal end of the radius. The people who are not doctors don't know, the radius, one of the 2 bones from the elbow to the wrist, broadens as it comes into the wrist, aligning with the 8 small bones of the wrist. It doesn't get smaller, it gets bigger.
Well, John Connolly was in the wrist. You had mentioned in the dissecting all of that and separating the 2 shots. Connolly was holding his hat, which was done.
Well, I'm going to get to that next. That's the trajectory. Let's stick with the condition of the bullet for a moment.
Okay.
So this bullet breaking 2 bones in a large boned gentleman like John Connolly, we're told, was completely intact. When you see the pictures, and these aren't Wecht's pictures, these are the government's pictures, the bullet is near pristine. The only deformation is at the base of the bullet, and that's from the impact of the firing mechanism. The copper jacket is completely intact, and yet we're told that it broke significantly, destroying, as I've said, 4 to 5 inches of one of Governor Connolly's ribs. So
this has never been replicated, right? Of the government, nobody's ever been able to replicate this.
I'm gonna get to that then, to wrap it up on the replication attempt. Sure, no, it's okay. But let me just finish. The third reason is the trajectory, and I've done this 1,000 times. Every time I speak to a group, whoever they may be, I get 2 people from the audience. I put them in chairs. You're the president and you're the governor, and 30 inches, 2.5 feet separates the president's chest from the governor's back. And then you show, as they're sitting, the governor directly in front of the president. The bullet comes into Kennedy's back, exits from the front of his neck. To begin with, by the way, the bullet has an upward trajectory of 11 degrees. And this is confirmed unanimously by the forensic pathology panel, of which I was a member, the radiology panel of the House Select Committee. That bullet moving upwards, having been fired from the 6th floor window, hitting the president in the back, somehow moves upward. Okay? So it's coming out of his neck. And then I show, with 2 people sitting there, the bullet is moving forward, it's moving to the left, and it's moving downward. It has to, having been fired from the school book depository 6th floor window. And yet the bullet in midair turns about 18 inches to the right, goes over, and hits Connolly behind the right armpit. Doesn't strike Connolly grazingly across the left shoulder or the left side of his back. It hits him behind the right armpit. It then proceeds through his chest and pierces the lung, destroys the right fifth rib, as I've said, exits from below the level of the nipple. And now we get to the point that you were just asking about. When you look at this Zapruder film, and again, it's not a matter of my interpretation. There's nothing subjective about it. It is clear, and you're studying this at 1/18 second intervals. So it's not a matter of what might have changed in a moment's notice of a second or two. You see John Connolly holding the big white Texas Stetson hat at shoulder level, well above the nipple. So that bullet emerges from below nipple level on the governor's chest, has to go upward and hook around to hit him in the back of the wrist, destroying the bone, exits from the front of the wrist, and then proceeds downward into the left thigh. The angle of declination through the governor's chest is about 27 degrees. The angle of declination from wrist to thigh is 45 degrees. So it changes course vertically, horizontally, and so on. Now, that is an absolute impossibility. Mm-hmm. And so there you are, weight, condition, and trajectory. There is no way in the world. Now, you also ask about attempts to replicate. Sure, the government realized they had a problem, and somebody on the Warren Commission said, hey, can Ebola do this? Let's try and see. And so they went and they shot. They had 3 targets lined up, cotton wadding. They shoot bullets into cotton wadding so that there will be no deformation. You want to see what the bullet looks like having come out of the gun. Number 2, they shot through goat carcasses that were lined up so the bullet would break one rib of a goat to simulate Conley's rib fracture. And then they got human cadavers, and they shot through the wrist into the radius to simulate Conley's wrist fracture. And this is my favorite slide. I always say when I talk about this, if God came to me and said, you have to give up every single thing you own, and I mean everything, I'm going to allow you to keep one thing. And I don't mean one thing in a category or in a volume. I literally mean one thing, one piece of paper, one slide, whatever it is. This is the one that I hold on to, and it is not mine. It is from the government. They have the lineup. They selected the bullets that they wanted to from the multiple shots fired into those 3 different objectives: cotton wadding, goat carcasses, and human cadaver wrist. And there you see it. There you see it. And I have so much fun when I do this. I show here's a bullet that they selected that has damage from the goat carcass, presumably, obviously, with the least amount of damage. Here's a bullet they selected that went through human cadaver wrist, obviously, with the least amount of damage. And then I come back to the other end of the slide, and I said, here is Commission Exhibit 399 in all of its pristine grandeur. Wow. So I say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm the prosecutor summing up the case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard the defendant's counsel make fun of what he calls the single bullet theory, the magic bullet theory, and so on. In a sarcastic way. I want to remind you and refresh you, it's been a long 6-week trial, and then they put up this slide. Do you have any question, ladies and gentlemen, if a bullet that breaks a goat rib can look like this, and a bullet that breaks a human radius can look like this? Do you have any question or doubt whatsoever that a bullet that breaks both a rib and a radius can look like this?
Exactly.
And so there's a single bullet theory. So before you get into everything else in the world, and it's not this, I'm uninterested, or that I don't think that's relevant. I find the whole thing fascinating. Lee Harvey Oswald, who was he? 2.5 years in Russia, marrying Marina Oswald. The whole thing, visits to Cuba, Mexico. I mean, everything in the world. But before you get to any of that, before you even open any of those doors, you've got the single bullet theory, which is the sine qua non of the Warren Commission report. If you don't have the single bullet theory, then stop. The game is over. You got 2 shooters.
Right.
And that is what the government cannot handle.
And that's why I wanted to kind of start with that as far as the JFK thing, because that really is the crux of it. You know, before I asked you that, I did want to say, you know, to really get, before you start pulling back all of these layers, you do have to go back and understand the political and geopolitical context in which JFK was elected, and also the farewell address by Dwight D. Eisenhower, speaking of the rise of the military-industrial complex.
Right.
The firing of Allen Dulles, the firing of Richard Bissell, the firing of Charles Cabell, which is no accident because Earl Cabell was the mayor of Dallas at the time. None of these things are accidents, and it is, of course, circumstantial. But what you're talking about is not. You're talking about in the history of ballistics, can these things have ever happened? And it's almost kind of like the 9/11. Never in the history of buildings do buildings fall from fire, but that day 3 did. One thing I didn't know, sir. I was watching one of your videos the other day. I did not know Kennedy was hit twice in the head. I thought it was one shot that blew his head up. You say you assert that there's 2 shots that hit him?
The official version is, of course, that he was struck one time. My version, and that of the top critic researchers, physician specialist David Mantik, a radiologist, Dr. Gary Aguilar, and many others who have studied this, clearly show, in my opinion, that he was struck in synchronized fashion twice in the head. One shot from the rear and one shot from the right front side behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. But the official version has him being hit in the head one time. But the head wounds are another matter. We haven't talked about that. The head wounds and the reconstruction, in my opinion, clearly show. And in that regard, let me make a point that is amazingly was ignored by the Warren Commission, and that is that every physician who attended the president there at Parkland Hospital that day talked about the wound in the back of the head, every single one of them. And a neurosurgeon of great note, of prominence, was there, and he talked about the cerebellum, which is at the inferior posterior portion of the brain, separate from the cerebral hemispheres. The cerebellum had been damaged. And yet that night at the autopsy, the pathologist, they have the back of the head intact, and they have no damage whatsoever to the cerebellum. Now, who do you believe? Top surgeons and emergency room people, and one of them continued to talk out about this, and we had him live on our program here in Pittsburgh when we had the 50th anniversary program. Dr. McClellan, he says unequivocally that the back of the head was shattered and the cerebellum was damaged. So who do you believe?
It's something that what you're speaking of was written very articulately and very comprehensively in a book by Dr. David Lipton, where he pretty much talks about what you're talking about, the reconstruction, the shady autopsy, the switching possibly of the bodies in Air Force One. One thing that was quoted in his book, 2 FBI people were quoted as saying it was, quote unquote, apparent that surgery to the area of the head had been performed before the autopsy started, and that's from an FBI man. And that's really, and that's the best evidence, as they say, is the body, and this is what they're using to kind of tell the tale. If you alter the body, then you're altering the tale. That's so very huge, obviously.
Yeah, well, it is, and that's a whole other issue. Not everybody agrees with David Lipton about surgery being performed. It's not so easy to do surgery, to change bullet holes. David, he is entitled to his opinion. He has no forensic pathology knowledge or plastic surgery. You don't just change bullet holes so easily. It's not like, doing a little bit of plastic surgery on somebody. But that's another matter. But I can tell you from a pathological, neuroanatomical, radiological standpoint, there's no question that the president was hit in the head twice.
Okay. Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, he's obviously had a lot of work on this subject. I can't keep him too much longer, but there's a couple more subjects I do want to ask him on. He's been obviously consulted on several different high-profile cases, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Elvis Presley, John Benet Ramsey. One of the other Kennedys, obviously, was assassinated under shady circumstances, Robert F. Kennedy. Obviously, Sirhan was charged and convicted of the crime. One of the huge things, and I, of course, have been studying this since I was a kid as well and did even a speech in college and such, one of the huge parts of this, again, is the ballistic and physical evidence. If you see how Sirhan was shooting Robert Kennedy, he was in front of him, a few feet of front to the right or left. But the shot that killed Robert Kennedy was 2 inches from behind his right ear, which again, one to 1.5 inches behind his right ear with a forward trajectory, which is physically impossible. Knowing the layout.
Absolutely. Sirhan was never behind Robert Kennedy, and Sirhan's gun was never 1 to 1.5 inches. It is right there. Anybody that doubts this or questions it, look at the autopsy report signed off on by a whole bunch of pathologists and top-notch academic people called in by Dr. Noguchi and so on, and absolutely ignored. It is unbelievable. If you wrote about this in fiction, you would say that the writer has gone too far. There it is. Absolutely unequivocal. And if anybody's wondering, well, how in the world could that be? The answer is it was never brought out in the trial of Sirhan. The prosecution obviously didn't touch upon it, and the defense attorney never called an expert, never questioned this, and it was never brought out in the trial of Sirhan that shot was fired 1 to 1.5 inches behind his right ear and had a forward trajectory.
Which is insane, because the only person behind him that the only other person with a gun, I mean, which was also ignored, is this gentleman, the security guard. I forget his name, but he
Eugene Feng Cesar.
There we go. And he supposedly had powder burns on him. I mean, it's just like it's pretty
his gun was never tested. And by the way, Eugene Feng Cesar, I think, was a member of the John Birch Society, interestingly, and so on. He was right behind the senator, and unbelievably, he was never interrogated, and most importantly, his gun was never taken from him to be tested. Also, one more point, 13 shots were fired based upon all of the recovered cartridges and the holes in the ceiling and on the towel and on the door frame. Sirhan's gun had only 8 shots, and he sure as heck never reloaded.
Yeah, and I've heard other people's books. I mean, I've read other people's books, like Dan Wildea, for example. He was supposed to come on last week, but didn't. He asserted, of course, Sirhan did it, and all these holes were just mistaken, incompetent stuff by the LAPD. And I just don't fall for that. You know what I mean? It's just things become too cut and dry, and especially when you have like the bullet hole 2 inch behind his head. You can't. There's nothing you can say to cover that kind of stuff up. So,
no.
Yeah, again, we could spend hours talking about these two subjects, and I don't have you much longer. I do want to ask you about one other subject, sir, that's kind of recently in the news. Obviously, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia died the other day, and again, it was just weird. I don't necessarily ascribe to it necessarily, but conspiracy theories are already flying around. However, I did read the news yesterday, and I know you guys aren't necessarily on the same page on everything. Dr. Baden, for another forensic pathologist, said in a recent report that he could have been poisoned, quote unquote, could have been poisoned. What are your thoughts on that, those statements, and the fact that there was not an autopsy allowed, and that this doctor declared his cause of death over the phone as natural causes without even seeing the body? What are your thoughts on these?
I've done a lot of commenting on that. Let me just summarize it for you. You got the justice going there. He tells his security people he doesn't need them. He was with somebody else that was logged in. We don't know who that person was, male, female, whatever. And then he's in good health. And he goes to his room, and he's found the next day. The justice of the peace is on her way to examine the body, look at it, and interrogate people at the scene. She receives a call from the federal marshals telling her that she need not go. They'll take care of it, and they'll have everything done. The body is taken to the local funeral home. It is embalmed and then flown off to Washington, D.C. No medical person, no medical legal investigator, no forensic scientific investigator ever saw that body.
How irregular?
That is absolutely, it was a totally controlled situation.
And similar situation as President Kennedy. The body was taken out before Texas law, fulfilling Texas law.
It is similar. It's similar to some extent. It's more similar to Nelson Rockefeller, who died in the arms of his lover in the Fifth Avenue condo, and they finessed an autopsy. More similar to Mary Jo Kopechne, who died under suspicious circumstances, who was never autopsied. And then Kennedy's, in the sense that the feds intervened. There is no basis whatsoever. There is no basis. The only exclusions for medical examiner and coroner's offices in dealing with violent, sudden, suspicious, unexpected deaths, homicide, accident, suicide relate to a president and a vice president. That's legislation passed after Kennedy's assassination. A justice of the Supreme Court, a governor, a U.S. senator, if they're killed in a motor vehicle accident, if they're shot by somebody, if they commit suicide, whatever, that case is no different from you or me or Mr. John Smith or Susie Brown. So the feds had no authority, no jurisdiction whatsoever over his body. And the final point I want to make on the whole thing is, you put it together and wonder about what the heck is going on. And amazingly, nobody having seen that body whatsoever. It is now, I think, coming on a whole week since that death. And ponder this. Not one single word has been said by the wife or the 9 children or through a spokesman for them. Why don't somebody say, look, our beloved father, husband is dead. We grieve. We're satisfied. He had a medical problem and so on. Please respect our grief and join us in this great moment of solace and respect for this wonderful human being and so on. Not a single word from the family. Is that something? I mean, think of the powerful position he has. Think of the connections that he must have in Washington, D.C. Think of the power of that family. And nobody has a word to say after 7 days,
Right.
and nobody saw that body, and no blood was drawn for toxicological testing, and no autopsy was done. No, it stinks to high heaven. And just absolutely incredible.
And the implications are obviously huge. The
Well, they're sure. They are absolutely. Well, okay. So there you have it. Life in America.
Yeah, exactly. There you have it, man. From 1963 all the way up to 2016, that's change under the sun, folks.
That's right.
Dr. Cyril,
well, I appreciate.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, I was
just going to say thank you for.
No, absolutely. But there was one final segment that I asked my guests to do. I will ask you to do it really swiftly. It is called the Conspiracy Triangle of Doom. It is essentially 3 questions that I ask everyone. You can say yes or no, or you can expound. Question number 1, sir. Do you, Dr. Cyril Wecht, believe in the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence?
No, but with a caveat, not with the arrogance of somebody that says impossible. When you think of the billions, trillions of stars and celestial bodies out there, how is it possible for us to say that there is no way in the world? I don't believe in it because there's been no proof or evidence of it.
You are a scientist.
I do not say that it is impossible. There's a difference.
There you go. Question number 2, sir, and I think we know the answer to this question. Do you follow the narrative or the official story of the events of November 22nd, 1963?
I have a lot of questions. November 22nd, 63. Well, you've heard my comments on that.
Yeah, exactly.
The Warren Commission is pure fiction, and it's just a disgrace and an insult and a travesty of justice that this case was not properly pursued and exposed.
Agree, sir. A little bit more contemporary in following narratives. Do you follow the narrative or the official story of the events of September the 11th, 2001?
Well, I think there are a lot of questions indeed that have been raised by prominent, objective, and non-political scientists about the kind of implosion that occurred and whether it could have possibly have been accomplished by a plane crashing into each of the 2 buildings and so on, 2 planes. So I have some questions there, and I think that the full investigation was perhaps not conducted, and not everything has been disclosed.
I do agree, sir. I do agree. Again, sir, thank you so very much
for
your time.
Thank
you have been my hero. Continued success. This has been Dr. Cyril Wecht, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you. All right, a pleasure. Thank you. All right, nice talking to you.
Absolutely. This has been It's Me Speaking to You, ladies and gentlemen, with Dr. Cyril Wecht. Everybody take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.